Good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome. I'm Romina, as Margaret just said. I see a lot of people are wearing, well, not that many, but I have a few people wearing green. I wonder why. Well, for those who are wearing green, we all know that today is World Environment Day, and what we're doing today is an inspiration from World Environment Day. And I'm not sure how many of you are actually aware or in touch with recent happenings in the climate change. Would we want to have a raise of hands? Does everyone know about the statistics? No, great. Well, I'm really privileged to introduce the topic today of climate change. A topic that's really close to my heart, and I think that should be close to everyone's hearts, because climate change is not an event that's happening far away in the North Pole where glaciers and the iceberg is melting. Climate change is not just about typhoons and earthquakes that we hear about in the news. The climate change for me is something that's very individual, something that happens in our everyday life, something that affects the quality of the water we drink, of the food we eat, and most of all, climate change is about improving the quality of our life. So definitely, I think it's a very touching subject for us. And even though it might sound abstract sometimes, today what we want to see is not, talk about numbers or statistics, because NGOs and different organizations are already doing that, trying to tackle and combat this problem. But what we want to do today is really look at this from a spiritual perspective. Instead of looking at the problem of climate change, what we want to do today is explore the spiritual solutions that we can find. And today we have two experts in the area. We have Dr. Alan Race, Reverend Dr. Alan Race, who's a rector and has another hidden talent. He's actually a journal editor for a magazine called Interreligious Insights. And what Dr. Alan Race believes in is that actually religions can come together, we can unify, and we can find spiritual solutions. And on my right-hand side, we have Sister Jayanti, who is, as Margaret said, the European Director of the Brahma Kumaris, but who's also someone who's extremely interested in the concept of climate change. She's actually our UN representative for, the NGO representative of the United Nations. Climate change is a very complicated topic, so I do get mixed up. But what's most important to know about her is that, yes, she's had a lot of expertise and knowledge in climate change, but what we want to know today is her spiritual insights and the spiritual solutions she can offer to actually look at this issue that's very much a challenge for all of us today. So with no further ado, I'd like to invite both of them to share a little bit. Probably. Okay.
I'm just testing the mic. Now that sounds as though it works. I'm only used to these ones you put on the jacket. There we are. It's very nice to be at Global Cooperation House. I've been here several times over many years, so I count myself as a sort of friend of the enterprise, as it were, here, certainly the spiritual endeavours. The World Congress of Faiths, which I'm part of, has been mentioned, has numerous meetings here in tandem and in collaboration with other groups for the purposes of exploring the kind of dialogue between us, mainly. So I'm familiar with the territory, the geography of the house. Climate change. I think it's as well to see what is happening in a kind of longer view. That's to say, with a kind of historical eye. We know that over history, cultural change has happened and has kind of accelerated at various points and various times. and great shifts have taken place in kind of human perception. Whether, for example, the move from human beings as hunter-gatherers into settled communities brings with it a whole different set of new questions and new perceptions and ways of looking at the world and what our human meaning might be. Or when whole civilizations rise and fall away, so the Roman civilizations say, which they seem to endlessly study in junior school these days. That's another occasion. But more particularly, I think for our purposes, the whole rise of the kind of scientific revolution and scientific consciousness of just 2-3 centuries ago now, and that we're living within that shift. And it does seem to me that when you get amazing shifts of this kind in human history, that new questions do arise and new perceptions arise about meaning, purpose, about what is our believing now, what is our ethical behavior to be now, what is our knowing in the light of new things that we've come to see and perceive. And I think the whole as a shift in how we perceive the world as a result of the scientific revolution has been very deep and lasting, and we're right inside it, and have been for some time. This microphone here is all part of the technological revolution that comes from the scientific revolution. We can't say our lives are not shaped by it. I was trained as a scientist. I value that way of investigating the world and coming to know things. But as I say, at the same time, what happens, it seems to me, with the scientific revolution is you get a split, essentially, between human beings and the world about them. A split which objectivizes the world about them, and where the powers of being able to manipulate the world about us takes on a greater scope. And that objectivizing has gone on a pace such that the natural world around us, our environment we call it, or nature, or the created order, comes to be seen as something to be manipulated for human purpose only. That's part of what it means to have the split. And therefore, climate change, it seems to me, and I'm going to say, or I'm going to assume, that actually the science is pretty well kind of assured about this, that it is happening, not in the future, as you say, but right now, and is kind of increasing, actually. So, if you're a skeptic, you have to argue for that tonight. So climate change comes, therefore, as a result of the manipulation of the natural order in the ways that we've known about the last couple of centuries through the Industrial Revolution and so on. So if we're to find some kinds of solutions to it, it does seem to me that there's also a very deep sense in which it's to do with the way we perceive our world and ourselves in it, or as part of it, or over against it. And certainly the last couple of hundred years, I think, you can trace the philosophy and the science and so on, which talks, at least in the Western sense, more and more in terms of domination and manipulation of the natural world for human purposes. So that sense of human self-consciousness over against the kind of environment really, we might say, has to be looked at again because of, that's where the situation we're now in climate change, which we think, or at least I think, is not one issue among others, but is a kind of overriding concern under which kind of all else can sit and does sit. So how to, if you like, heal that split and that kind of rift? There's one route you can take, which is to say, Well, we are all just kind of natural in our state, and we ought to get back to some kind of natural state of being, if ever there was such a thing. A bit like, who was it, that painter who went somewhere to discover natural people, but he didn't really find it because it doesn't quite exist in that way. So, we can all turn into hugging trees or going nude on the beach or whatever it is, somehow assume some naturalistic state that is ours. Well, I don't think that's possible. That's a kind of romanticism. Or at the other side of it, particularly for religious people, we might say, well, we abdicate a sense of responsibility, and as it were, we're in apocalyptic times. So it's up to whatever there is out there, which we call the divine, to solve the matter. So you abdicate your responsibility for it. I think that's not really a solution for us either. So, for me, we need to find some balance between what I call contemplative wisdom and prophetic consciousness. Those two things, which are often thought to be as two different sides of the brain, or certainly arise in two clusters of religious awareness in the world. A prophetic consciousness, Semitic, Western, contemplative awareness, Eastern, Indian, and so on. Well, those two have got to belong together now. So our sense of contemplating the world is to try and rediscover our place within it, yet not to be subsumed by it. That's to say, there is a need, I think, to retain some sense of self-consciousness of human beings over and against other things in its environment. But over and against, not for the manipulation, but for the question of where does our responsibility lie now? Not over against, but as part of, but yet not being subsumed by our environment. Or thinking of ourselves as a one equal with other species, as a sense in which we sort of are, but actually I wonder whether that's being true to who we are as well, with a sense of self-consciousness that we have. That's on the one side. Prophetic awareness on the other side is meant, I think, to engender some sense of hope. That's what prophetic awareness does. That action and responsibility is possible for change, and that we need the inspiration and the spirit in order to bring that about. And the change would be to rebalance maybe that sense of our place within the world, which wants to, at least I want to, retain all that kind of scientific knowing that we've acquired through the massive historical shift that has happened with the rise of science, but yet not, as it were, be captive to a kind of scientism. Scientific ways of knowing the world are a method, they're not a kind of final solution. So finding our balance between those two things seems to me the important way forward. I'm going to stop there. I don't have about 10 minutes. But
Thank you very much. That was a lot of rich information. Sister Gently, would you like to share a little bit?
Thank you. Dr. Race has set the background, and I'd just like to pick up on that and take it further. We've had the miracle of science and technology and all the amazing developments that we take for granted in today's world. And over the last couple of 100 years, there's been gradually more and more of a shift towards materialism and consumerism. And I see that happening in India in a very dramatic way. When I used to go back to India in the 60s, there was quite a huge difference between the West and India. And when I go back to India today, and just Mumbai airport, I don't know whether anyone's recently been there. I mean, London Terminal 1 and 2 look, well, 2 has gone, but certainly Terminal 1 looks old compared to the international airport in Mumbai. It's quite spectacular and glamorous. That really is the right word for it. And Delhi again the same. And that's just a little cameo of what you see in parts of India. And then of course you still have the huge amount of poverty, but yet still it's as if there's this veneer of consumerism that's come in a very, very big way in India. Some years ago, and I'm sure that statistics have gone further and beyond, but some years ago I heard that the middle class of India is equivalent to the middle class of the whole of Europe, all the countries of Europe. So it just gives you an idea. But what I've also seen, and still in India you can see the huge contrast. I spend a fair amount of time in a place called Mount Abu, Rajasthan. And Rajasthan is maybe one of the most deprived areas of India. And you see things that are really such a huge contrast. The big shopping malls in some of the big cities, I would say every city actually, every city in India has big shopping malls now. But then you see the very basic, simple, and yet in a way, very charming life. And I'm not romanticizing poverty by any means, but you see the relationships that exist between the children and their parents, and children laughing. And here in London, I know probably there are pockets where you hear children laugh, but in Abu you seem to be hearing children laugh everywhere. And so there's such a big contrast. But what's happened with consumerism and materialism is that there comes a point where you can't buy more and more and more, and yet we still keep trying. And shopping is now recognized as being an addiction. You heard about the addiction to substances before, but now you hear a lot about addiction to shopping. And around Christmas time and around July sales time, there's a bus route, a bus that runs along this main road, Pound Lane, and it goes to Brent Cross. And it says, and I've seen this every year for several years now, so it's a campaign that they roll out, Christmas and July sales, and it says, feed your addiction. And you know, they've got all these consumer goods with different types of things on their bus posters. So on the one side it's recognized as being an addiction, and on the other side it's okay. You know, feed it, it's fine, you're going to fill the tills. So carry on shopping, shop till you drop. What is this doing to the world in which we live? Well, forget about gratitude and appreciation and regard for Mother Earth. It's a very beautiful statement, this idea of Mother Earth, but we don't actually recognize that in the same way anymore. And that concept of Mother Earth, the one who's feeding us, nourishing us, sustaining us, caring for us, and not just us today here, but has done so for thousands of years. And yet within the space of 100 years or so, what we've done is really plundered Earth so completely that at this point, I think Earth is totally exhausted and tired. And we see the impact of this on the climate. I remember as a child, people used to say that the climate is changing, and I don't mind telling you my age. So I'm talking about the 60s, at the end of the 60s, and I remember playing with other children, and our parents would come out and they would chat, and they would say the climate is changing. And you know why? It's because we're sending spaceships into the atmosphere and they're having an impact. And at that moment, it was just a fancy idea that people had, that we're interfering with whatever is the system of the universe, and so it's having an impact. But yet today we see that it is a reality. Human beings, and just simply for the sake of acquisition and for the sake of trying to satisfy an empty space within the self, have gone into the extremes of materialism, and the shopping syndrome is just one impact of that. But this desire to conquer matter, to conquer the earth, rather than be a trustee and care for the earth and look after the resources of the earth, it's two very different aspects of consciousness. And so the one consciousness which really has destroyed the planet, and the other consciousness now becoming aware that as human beings we have a responsibility to the world around us and to all forms of life. And of course there's a very big question that comes up, and that is it too late for us to do something? But I believe that whatever time and effort and energy is put into doing things in a constructive way, maybe we're not going to be able to see the impact of that externally immediately, but what it's doing is shifting our attitude, shifting our particular behavior, so that we're creating respect for the world around us. We are also creating a sense of responsibility and accountability for whatever it is we do whilst we're here. So essentially I'm seeing that a spiritual consciousness means one in which I begin to take up responsibility and treat the world around me with respect, instead of just thinking that it's a resource that I can just take from endlessly.
I have loads of questions in my head at the moment. Perhaps since it's quite fresh and you just what you just mentioned, Sister Jayanti, I think intellectually, not just myself, but I think a lot of us do understand what you're saying, in the sense that yes, we need to have personal accountability on the planet Earth and, Mother Earth. And sometimes when I'm in nature, or I'm, in a beautiful setting, I have that realization. But for someone like me who spends most of the time in the city, in building blocks and working, 9 to 6, I sometimes feel that I'm quite disconnected from this concept, and I'm not able to resonate with it in a sense. It's just little glimpses that I get of it, but I don't usually feel that connected. I have to make an effort to feel connected. So how would you create that shift?
I was just thinking about how we sometimes think about nature as the world out there, and yet in spiritual terms I can think of myself in terms of my spiritual identity as that inner being, the spirit. And I can begin to think about this body of mine also as nature, because you can't buy it, you can't sell it, it's come to us from the universe, and it's come from the earth. And so maybe one of the easy steps of taking responsibility for nature is actually taking responsibility for this particular body that I occupy, and recognizing that this is a gift of the universe, this is sacred, and I have to take responsibility for caring for it. And maybe whether you live in a concrete jungle or whether you're out in the country, so this immediate connection of I and my, this body of mine, is a very simple thing in which you can begin to see how soul and body work together, that when the soul takes responsibility, then it's going to care for this and recognize this as something sacred and not abuse it or misuse it, but use it in the best possible way.
But then you're on the other side of the coin, where your interest is only for yourself, for selfish motives, because you want to take care of this body and you want to make sure that you're fine. And then for some reason, you get too consumed by materialism in a way.
It's interesting because this shift of consciousness, instead of the I just being this personality and this being, when you begin to think of yourself as that spirit, then you're not isolating yourself from everyone else, but rather you're beginning to connect with the spirit within every human being. Whereas in the other personality, in that consciousness, it's a very limited, narrow vision of the self, just I. And in that case, yes, there's total selfishness and materialism. And in fact, this word materialism is very much connected with matter. And so my identification of my own identity with matter, I am a woman. And you begin to think of the spirit and you say, hey, hold on, am I a woman? Well, I occupy a woman's body, but I am spirit. And so you move out of that narrow identification that's connected just with the physical, and moving into the spiritual dimension, you connect with everyone around you. And so I'm going to use a word that's difficult to digest, detachment. But this detachment of soul from just the narrow identity of the body also gives me a different perspective. It widens my perspective. And so then I'm able to connect with everybody else. So it's actually the path through which I'm able to let go of selfishness and just my own physical concerns, and my connection with the big family, the whole human family. And I see very much this whole aspect of the environment being a subject that connects us together, in which, because at this moment, if all of us together as a human family, and I don't just mean the people in this room, but I mean, the family out there, whichever part of the world we come from, whatever religion we belong to, but it's one family. And that awareness of one family and the planet as one home, and then you're going to break the deadlock that's come about in the climate negotiations, because I've been attending these things for some years now, and it's a disaster. And I don't know how much newspapers report on it in Britain, because I'm away at that time usually, so I don't see the papers here. But there's really, it's like, people in different corners, and they can't get out of their corners and actually come together and see what's going on and what needs to be done. Whereas the spiritual awareness of one family, one home, and maybe then we can do something.
Can I just add a little bit?
Yes.
To that, I mean, more or less being on the same wavelength, I think. But I used to think, and I think I still do, quite a bit of me, that if you really got to know the facts about these things, the oceans, the soil, the air, the forests, whatever that makes up what happens underneath the umbrella of climate change. If we got really to know the facts and the figures and the amount of carbon and so on, because I enjoy that too, with the kind of scientific side of the brain, that I suppose that would initiate a change in consciousness, in myself and in everybody else. We'd all wake up to what's happening. But it doesn't work like that, does it? And sometimes it has the opposite effect of kind of making you sort of become sort of stopped in your track by it, impossible to move, and rather stunted. Gosh, it's like that. I remember reading in James Lovelock's last book, the Gaia hypothesis, man, that if we carry on as we are at the end of the century, there's only room for 1 billion people on the planet.
Wow.
So I read that and I did a double take. So but that almost shuts down the mind, or shuts down the kind of spirit for action again, to do something about it.
Did that discourage you, on the other hand?
No, it made me think, hell, what? What next? But he also said, actually Britain will be one of the places where it's not so badly affected as many others. That's not for your comfort, but just as a kind of observation. And that we ought to plan now for double the population, because we can easily do that even on a small island like this. Now, how is that going to go down in the political corridors of power?
Not very well.
Considering all the hoo-ha that we have every day about immigration, and so on. But he's since pulled back a little bit from that point of view, but the trajectory is sort of there. So just learning the state of things, is what I'm saying, is somehow not enough. There's got to be the perception, the spiritual perception, I would say, with you on that, of course, which then provides the energy to bring about the change, and so on.
So can I ask you something on that, actually?
And I think we've actually all got this spiritual energy within our traditions. You mentioned some of it, which is about reconnecting again with ourselves, with the earth, with other species, and so on, without being romantic about that or apocalyptic about it either. If you're a Buddhist, you'll talk about the Buddha nature shared between everyone. If you're a Christian, I'll talk about the body of Christ shared in the world. If you're Hindu, you might talk about Brahman everywhere, and, your Atman, and so on. There are resources, in other words, in our traditions, deep wells of wisdom that actually provide the alternatives on the picture, or provide a stimulus at least, if not the details of what has to be done, but the stimulus of how to perceive our connection one with another. That's all I would add to you. But there's also, I think there actually is emerging, and this is perhaps more among Christian writers, I'm not sure, a view that the kind of scientific community can also will also be part of the goodies on this, not just the baddies or the neutrals. And that is the story of the universe, is an emergent story which connects us all. We've all got a shared DNA with everything else. And so these days we know that. And that some of our theologians talk about, we are the kind of universe come conscious of itself. And if that's the case, then you're right. We belong to our bodies and to one another, and so on, at some spiritual perceived level. And how to turn that into practice seems to me the challenge for the religious communities, at least.
I think it's a challenge for all of us. The how.
Without becoming sort of taking off into realms of something that no one can get hold of.
Because I really found interesting what you said about the split between, thinking about this theoretically, scientifically, and saying, well, actually we need to do something about it. And then you said about the other split, which is actually having that consciousness. And Sister Jenti, you also said something quite similar. Now, for me, on a personal level, I only first explored spirituality when I had a breakdown in my life, when things were not working out. That was the only time I actually tried to do something about it. Do you think, and it's a question to both of you, do you think you actually have to go through a breakdown in life for things to actually fall apart? Is there another way to make that shift of consciousness, or is it that we actually have to realize that unless we don't go through hardships, or unless we don't have actually a mental, physical, emotional breakdown, we won't want to change?
Well, I can say for myself that I wasn't at a point of breakdown, but it was sheer curiosity that brought me to study the teachings of Raj Yoga. So that's another side of it. But I think that there is something very interesting happening in the world. And say, for example, like in Warsaw, what we saw was that at the very start of Warsaw, there was news from the Philippines. And there was this huge super typhoon that had come, and the whole of the gathering was shocked. And then there was one particular individual who was from that region and who was representing the Philippines in the climate change negotiations. And he stood up and he spoke, and this is actually the month of fasting that they initiated at that point. They said that let there be a time that the world comes together and fasts to show sympathy and empathy for victims of climate change. And so at that time it was very clear that the sort of things that are happening in the world now, whether it was Hurricane Katrina or all the things that have happened subsequently, it feels as if it's not that we have to theorize about these things, but it literally is that nature is showing us that it's come to a state of breakdown, and it's shaking us, telling us, wake up, do something. And so that is the reality of our times today. So I'm interpreting your comments in a different way, in that generally speaking, yes, it is a state of breakdown. And because of this breakdown, I think many people are beginning to acknowledge that this is a reality, and so what is it that I can do?
I think there are things that religions have to help with too. I'm thinking now about this. Part of the problem is the sheer volume and numbers of people. I mean, that's why Lovelock said 1 billion, and that's a shock to us. We're at, what are we, 7 billion now? Something like that. Meant to be about 9 by 2050 is what people talk about. So where did the other 8 go? With my grandchildren, where did they be alive? Where did the other 8 go? So that, I think there is those kind of problems about human population, because it's human population that requires places to live, and therefore manipulation of the environment and food and so on. And the more populations grow, the more cities grow, the less room there is for animals, and so on. I have about 5 foxes that live at the bottom of my garden. And it's quite nice, except they screech a lot. I wish they didn't do that. But actually the people on the street screech more. So. What am I trying to say? The human population. Now, it's a controversial thing, or it's not a settled thing. Why aren't we promoting contraception, say? Or, some kind of teaching about responsibility of numbers of families and that kind of thing. Now, religious leaders can operate at those levels quite happily, but we don't. And that's a very kind of practical way in which we might make some little bit of difference, rather than just saying pray more or have a better contemplation about life, all of which is good.
So say we go back to the situation where we have 1 billion people and not 7 billion, and we take the 1 billion people don't you think they would go back to, you know, multiplying and you know, manipulating the environment, etc.? Even if we did, you know, try to find ways to lower the population, you know, the question is, how do you actually change that mindset from this idea of consumerism to simplicity, in a sense? Because that's what I'm hearing, the word simplicity, and cutting down is something that usually we look at negatively, you know.
Well, some of it is a function also of wealth and economics and so on. I think it's a fact that the kind of wealthier a country, the less breeding happens. Is that right? Roughly speaking, are they producing less in India now? They're getting more middle classes, or what? I mean, because, you know, well, you enjoy your wealth and you're not going to spend it on the children. But, you know, all of these are mixed motives and mixed ethics, isn't it? So there is therefore, you know, a kind of political and economic, we know this, angle to the whole discussion. That you know, people are beginning to write their books now on the economics of climate change, and that if you can show something at that level, that has a better chance of making a change. But the role for education has got to be there, hasn't it? In quite a strong sense, I think, and religious leaders and religious communities. This house here has a strong belief in education. have a you know, a great deal to say and a great deal of responsibility, I think, at that level. So basically, you're saying that it's a very specific type of education in terms of values, or? Oh, the whole lot, hasn't it? I mean, because at the end of the day, it is all connected, as we know. But there is a strong kind of value sense. I mean, but it is hard, isn't it? We know that smoking shortens your life, but actually the number of people who began smoking again has got going up, especially among young people. So somehow, why doesn't the message about the gruesomeness of the prospect change you? It doesn't, it seems. So how do you shift from that intellectual to actually saying... Well, therefore, that's where you have to touch us with the spiritual level, I think, at some point.
I think totally.
The facts by itself don't do it, unfortunately. So I love the facts.
It is a reality that it's only when I start thinking in terms of a spiritual consciousness and I begin to see how it's possible to tap into an inner happiness that's able to bring me contentment and satisfaction, that then I say that yes, I can simplify and I don't need all of these other things around me. Or again, you know, when it's a question of giving up habits that are dangerous, and in terms of the food we eat, the lifestyle that we have today, we can do a lot about that. But what we need to do is develop the inner power to be able to change our lifestyle and our habits. And you can't tell somebody change this and then they don't have the power and they're just trying to struggle with the facts. But if you start contemplation, meditation, it's a very active process. It's not just a process of detaching from the world and saying I'm not going to be engaged, but it's a process of inner preparation through meditation, filling yourself with great power so that then you are able to let go of the things you need to let go, and you have the capacity to be able to say, enough, I'm not going to have this anymore, I'm going to change my diet, I'm going to change my habits, I'm going to do what I need to do. So I see that spiritual education and helping people change, for example, even vegetarian diet. Vegetarianism can be a major contribution to reducing the carbon emissions, more so than even driving cars. So
I think it's ranked third in terms of the highest.
That's right.
Yeah.
And actually, when you hear about the sort of things that they're doing for animal production, it's actually now a whole thing of production. It's not just farming. And you hear about the antibiotics they're pumping into the animals to be able to produce more and more within cramped spaces. I don't want to go anywhere near there. So respect for the body, respect for nature, this nature, and then respect for nature out there, respect for other forms of life. And you're also developing another very important factor, and that is non-violence. I think it was Gandhiji who said that it's not going to be possible to have peace on the earth while we still have a diet that's based on violence. And so thinking about my own inner state of peace, thinking about non-violence, and having the power to be able to follow these things into my life. And yes, we begin to see a shift happening. But more than anything else, it's a question of shifting the mindset and learning to have that respect.
Thank you. So, Sister Jayanta, you spoke about the values of simplicity, respect, like you just said, and just value for life. And if you had to choose what values you felt would actually create a difference, Alan, which values would you choose and why?
Do you know the story of the American businessman who was called to the committee to explain the project that he was working on? He explained the project. I think there's several versions of this joke. This is my version. Explained the project it was, and then said, and these are the values that underpin this project. Da, 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 da. And if you don't like those, I've got a bag here with a whole lot more. So choose your project and I'll make up the values to go with it. Sorry, that's a kind of slight delaying tactic. Of mine. But an obvious kind of simplicity, an obvious simplicity of life goes without saying.
I probably should have asked you a value that you connect with, or that personally you use in your life.
Well, I mean, I think because all these things are kind of connected, it's the value of trying to heal the poverty in the world is also has an effect on climate change. And so there are a number of kind of project things that I support in different parts of the world as part of, well, partly charitable giving, but also going there and learning and bringing back the information that I might share with my church community or friends and so on. I have a daughter who's studying to be, well, she's just graduating as a doctor this year. I think I told you that earlier. She spent part of last year in Uganda in the project called Send a Cow. You know, I was thinking about, instead of buying people, presently buying a chicken or a goat or a cow. And I have good friends who were part of the origins of that work. So she went to find out what difference sending a cow made to the lives of the women in the villages in one area as a little research project, and to bring it back to Send a Cow in Britain and say, this is the effect, and maybe you could make some changes here or here or here to improve what you do, etc. So, I mean, all of that is painstaking work and commitment. So I think to actually look outside your own little kind of world and your own anxieties towards human need, and in a way which you can manage yourself to offer what you can. So I think it's those values that go with looking after the simplicity of one's lifestyle and so on.
So
I would say in the last 10 years I've simplified my lifestyle. Yeah.
So in a sense you're saying that once we become a little bit more conscious of how important it is to value life, how important it is to value things around us, and with that consciousness of being a spirit, we naturally dissolve all the anxieties, all the you know, little petty problems in the sense that, you know, actually are not that big, and we start to feel more giving in a sense. Would you say that?
I think that there's a way in which you can access your own original qualities of peace, of love and joy, and when you can access those through spirituality, that's the moment then that you're able to share. If I myself am feeling frustrated and discontent inside, what is it that I'm going to share? But when I've been able to connect with myself and access those resources, those treasures that are there within me, and I think that spending time in silence, spending time in meditation is a way to be able to do this. But also, then there's another part of the meditation in which we're able to connect with the one who's above, the creator, the source, and being able to take from the source, then you're able to have an abundance of all this. And that's when you really start giving. And the whole system of just taking, which is what the consumer society is about, you know, consume. I don't like this word, do you? It's not a nice word, and yet, you know, we're constantly hearing this word and we think it's good, consumer society. But it's not a nice word, and so rather than just taking, when I'm able to receive and fill myself, I'm able to start giving something to others. And we were speaking about values, but maybe love for life, love for the eternal self, love for the souls around me, love for nature, love for all animals, all living beings. If that comes in within our frame, then our behavior would be different, and our care and compassion for humans, but also for the world, would be very visible then.
Thank you. And if I had to ask you, Alan, what is your outlook on the future of the world? What would you say?
Well, curiously, I'm beginning to be convinced by arguments of a friend of mine that actually things are an awful lot better than you think. It's slightly counterintuitive and counter-news, but his line of argument is that we're so evolving in terms of values at the present time that actually things at that level, at the value level, are a whole lot better than they've ever been. So he makes a value judgment about that. It's not just they're different, but they're kind of better. So, you know, we're not going to go back intellectually to saying patriarchy is a good thing, for example. Are we? Certainly not in this house. Actually, there have been far fewer wars in recent times than history wrote. I'm thinking of the big book, or is it the Angels of Our Better Nature, or the Nature of Our... No, Angels of Our Better Nature, do you know that one? Where actually the violence in the world has decreased hugely. And we now have the whole business of, you know, human rights, for example, etc. So there's a whole way in which you can sort of look at the shifts that have come about that put us in a different space in terms of values. And that, okay, there's where it looks as though it's not working, that's a sort of resistance to the shift, but that won't win. Religious fundamentalism won't win, as it were. It's already dead as it was born. It doesn't feel like that sometimes, but kind of intellectually and in terms of value shift, it's happened. We're in a kind of mopping up kind of stage, and this can be demonstrated. So I think, you know, that's where education does come in, well, to help convince people. So one could be optimistic about the future also, and I think it's important to tap into that. that side of things.
That's a very positive outlook, actually. I mean, if religions are coming together and unifying...
That's another manifestation of a kind of valueship. The whole business of kind of the dialogical respect between one another, with our differences and so on, working together and our decision to learn from one another, etc. Well, that's very recent, but actually we're not going to go back on that anymore. We're thrown together, and we have to make sense of that. You have to make sense of me and you.
So in a sense, what Sister Jayenti is saying about bringing in that spiritual consciousness, bringing in that feeling of being a family, you're actually seeing that in different religious leaders coming together and feeling that actually this shift is becoming positive.
It's happening in different ways. It happens at leadership levels. It probably happens better at more local levels right now, when people come together for different purposes. So I've just been where I am in South London for 3 years, but already the kind of Jews, Muslims and Christian groups which I've managed to get together, have begun sharing themselves.
Thank you. And if there was one message you could give us for tonight, because I'm aware of time now, if there was one message you could give to all of us today, something that you feel could make a difference in our lives, an insight, what would it be?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I don't think you can do better than the old Gandhi talisman, which is, to think of what difference your action each day might make to the poorest of the world, and to act in that light.
That's very profound, actually.
It's not mine, it's from Gandhiji.
But you're giving us that message.
Yeah.
I think it would be that it's important to look inside and find the happiness that lies within, so that then I become less dependent on all the external things to provide me with happiness, but finding that happiness within, then to be able to share that with others.
Thank you very much. I think we're coming to a close, but I'd like to invite Sister Jayenti to conduct a meditation for us.
Sitting quietly, reflecting on the things that we've been hearing about, and deciding to take a journey within. And as I go inwards, I want to see whether I can feel this very specific relationship of the inner being with this body. And as I go inwards and find that inner space, that space where I live, the being that I am within, I begin to feel how I, the soul, occupy this very precious vehicle, this home, this body, And I slowly begin to understand how the inner state of being impacts this physical body of mine. When I'm peaceful, I can feel my body respond with harmony. And I know when I lose that peace, this body of mine goes into imbalance. Now I begin to reflect on how my inner state of being not only impacts this body of mine, but impacts the world around me. When I'm peaceful, the atmosphere around me is charged with peace. But also, I know that in peace, the actions that I perform are peaceful actions, ones of support and cooperation for others around me. In a state of peace, my actions help the world of nature, all the other beings around me. And in the past, when I lost that peace, my actions created chaos and disorder and upheaval. Reflecting on how I can impact my body, the atmosphere, and the world, I begin to feel the need to maintain my own inner state of calm and peace. My peace is valuable for me, but also my peace is my contribution to the world. And as we hold peace in our minds together, our collective energy multiplies the power of peace. And peace reaches out and I have begun to walk the path of peace, leading to a destination of peace for all. this awareness of peace, feeling comfortable with the state of peace, recognizing that this is actually my natural state. I come back to the awareness of the things here and now. But I know that I can support the world with thoughts of peace anytime I choose. Om Shanti.
Thank you very much. I don't know about all of you, but I didn't want to come back. Thank you for sharing that, especially sharing that once we're in that moment and that space of peace, we can actually share and make an impact on our surroundings and our environment by bringing peace to others. So thank you very much. It was really a privilege and a pleasure to have your company, both of you this evening, and all of you as well. So thank you very much for tonight. And let Margaret lead us.